In this video, we will talk about static. We will learn a new keyword in Java, static. Before we start that, just to recap, we already understand the concept of classes and objects. So we know that a class not only represents a real world entity, but it is also a template, a blueprint of how an object would look like. Whatever we define in a class, the object of that class will be created accordingly. It will have the same properties and it will act on those methods whatever we defined in the class. So for example, here we have a class employee. It has two properties, name and ID, and a single method do work. So we know that any object of employee class would have two properties, name and ID, and we can call do work method on the instance. And these are instance variables, right? We learned about instance variables. So as the name suggests, these variables are related to the instance, to the object of that class. Now here we are creating two objects. So first we created object 1 and we initialized the name and ID with Tom and 1. And here we are showing that whenever we call the method of the class, we need the object. So we call a method on an object. We need an object to call the method. So that also shows that the methods are related to the object, to the instance. We cannot call them directly. So here we see when this line was executed, a new object was created on the heap. This new object has its own set of properties, name equals to Tom and ID equals to 1. And when we are calling the do work method, we are calling on this object. So this is specific to this object. This is something private to this object. Similarly, when we created another object, object 2, so we initialize the value job and 5, and again if we call the do work method, although the do work method is declared once in the class, but it is related to the instance. So each instance has its own behavior. It doesn't know about any other object. So we need the object, and here we are calling the method on the object 2. And similarly, a new object will be created on the heap with its own values here, and the method will be local to this object. Now what if we want to have something that is not related to an instance, that is not specific to a particular instance, but it is shared among all the objects of that class? It is common for all the objects of that class. So we cannot directly add a property here, for example, because if we add a new variable here, it will be an instance variable, and again it will be specific to a particular instance, to a particular object of that class. So it is not shared, it is not common. To solve this problem, Java provides the keyword static. It says that if you want to have a property that is shared or that is common for all the objects of that class, you can mark that property, mark that variable static. So for example, in this class, if we want to have a counter maybe, and we want to count how many objects of this class have been created, then this is the requirement, that we need to have a variable that will that is not specific to an object, because if this is specific to an object, then whenever we create a new object, it will be given a default value, an initial value. So if this is an integer, it will always be initialized to 0 for an object. So we don't want to do that. We want a counter to retain its value. Whenever we are creating an object, we want to increment that value. So to do that, we can add a new variable in the class with the keyword static, and then let's say counter, and of course the data type, for example int. So whenever we mark a variable static, it is an indication that this is not related to the instance, but it is related to the class. So static variables are related to the class level. So these are class level variables, not the instance level variables. So if we mark this variable as static, then it will be common for all the objects. If we create a new object, it will be shared with that object. And one more thing, if we have a static variable, then because it is a class level variable, it belongs to the class, we can access them in a different way. So we know that if, for example, in this case, here, if we want to access the name property, then we do something like object or the reference variable and dot name. Because it is an instance variable, so to access the property we need an instance, and that's what we are doing. We are accessing the property by the object. But in case of static variables, because they do not belong to any object, they belong to class, so we can access them differently. To access a static variable, we need the name of the class, then the variable. Or within the same class we can access them directly. We can write simply counter. We don't need to have a reference variable or an object to access the static variable. So that is on the static variables. Similarly, we can have static methods in a class. So till now we have seen instance variables. So for example, we write a method something like this: public void do work. Let's take the example of the same method, and let's say there is some SOP, some message here, and this is in a class. So whenever we want to call this this method, we call it something like that: object 1, for example, dot do work. Because this is an instance method, so we need an instance to call the method. That's how we have been writing methods and calling the method. But methods can also be static, which means the behavior or the method that we are writing in the class, it does not make sense to bind it with an object. Maybe it's a utility method which should be on the class level, not on the object level. So in that case, we can create a method with static keyword, so that will be a static method. How do we do that? It's simple actually. Access modifier, then the new static keyword, and everything else remains the same. So we can convert the same method in a static method by just adding the static keyword here. That's how we write a static method in the class. Now how do we invoke it? As we said, it belongs to the class, so it doesn't need an object. It doesn't need a reference variable to be invoked, so we can call it directly. We can call a static method via the class name dot do work. That's how we write the static methods, and that's how we call them. So coming down to the final point, because static variables and static methods, they belong to the class, they are class level properties. So in general, we can access a static property or a static variable by the name of the class. So employee dot, or in general, class name dot any static variable, or class name dot any static method. All right, so that should be it on the static variables and static methods from theory perspective. In the next video, we will see a quick example, a quick program on the static. But that's it for now. Thank you.